Hello and welcome to our next session in this series all about transitioning to digital assessments. Today we're going to be talking about the really important topic of ensuring fairness in digital assessments. My name's Sean Crowley. I am the Director of International Business Development for AQA Global Assessment Services. I'm joined in the studio by Ben Rockcliffe, who is Director of UK Business Development for AQA Global Assessment Services, and Gemma O'Brien, who is National Programme Manager for Alpha Plus, which is AQA's consultancy and projects unit. And I'm also joined remotely by a panel of experts from AQA Education, Alpha Plus and Inspira Assessment. So let's get straight into it then. How do we ensure fairness when moving from traditional paper-based assessments to digital assessments?
When they're carrying out their assessment or they're taking their assessment within the assessment system, that learners are not encountering any features of the system for the first time when they're taking that test or that assessment. And that's why familiarisation assessments are a really, really important part of preparation for shifting to digital assessment. We want learners to understand the types of items or the assessment approach that's going to be used in the assessment. And we also want them to be familiar with the system features so they're confident and they're comfortable and they know what it is that they're going to encounter in the assessment when it happens.
Thanks, Gemma. I'm going to turn to you, Ben, and I'm really interested in that transition from print to digital and the effect that has on fairness. What do we need to consider around that?
Well, I think the first thing about being fair is acknowledging that there is a difference and there is a mode effect. So clearly, if you do an assessment on screen, you're going to be able to answer the question or item in a slightly different way than if you're doing it on a paper-based assessment. So we have to know that and acknowledge it. Some people will use assessments which are available in both formats, and if people are doing dual mode assessments, then I think it's important that there's an awarding process or a review process at the end of the assessment that accounts for the fact that people are doing the assessments in those different ways and checks to acknowledge those differences and accounts for them in the end result.
That's a good point. I'm going to bring Simon Trevors in from Inspira Assessment. Simon, hi. What are the considerations around single and dual mode assessments? What are the benefits that they bring?
It's absolutely critical during exam delivery and during results and resulting processes that students are evaluated or test takers are evaluated in the same way as other cohorts their year and compared to cohorts in previous years. Now, one of the things that you can take advantage of through a transition to digital assessment is being able to do things like pre-testing and standards fixing or standardization of your test content and your question items. But by moving to on-screen assessment, you can also take advantage of new question types. So, for example, computer programming question types, where you can actually see the code being run on screen and you can test it as part of your assessment, locked down securely, but it's a completely different experience for the candidate. It enables you to evaluate skills and knowledge in new, different ways. That actually helps with fairness and inclusion, because some of the benefits of digital assessment are you can test knowledge and skills in different ways, and you can make that more realistic and more akin to the environment that learner might face when they get into the working world.
So let's just hear from Sophie Emmertson from Inspira Assessment.
There is a bulk of research pointing to the fact that for students, actually it might offer some fairness benefits moving on to digital, because you can individualize without risking the parity and the quality and the performance of the assessments. You can individualize to a larger degree both the means of delivery for candidates. So candidates that have special needs, for example, they would be taken care of in a more individualized and adaptive way with digital tools. They can be allowed to use special tools, text-to-speech, whichever programs and software tools that they're used to using in their everyday life. They can bring that into the assessment room, into the delivery room, and use that also on test day. That ensures just generally some fairness around a certain category of students and learners that are not all of a sudden put in a situation where they're completely unfamiliar with the rules of the game, as it were, during that test day.
Okay, so we talked about the context really around ensuring assessments are fair. Let's think about the students now, and let's think about that preparation for exam day and what needs to happen there. And I think the question here, and I'll start with you, Gemma, is how do you prepare candidates fairly for digital exams so that they can achieve their potential?
So obviously the experience of taking a digital exam or a digital assessment is really different to a kind of traditional pen and paper test. Firstly, there will be a need to sort of log into the system, carry out various administrative aspects that are likely to be unfamiliar to students, which we would want them to have an opportunity to practice before the assessment event itself, so that this doesn't cause any kind of unnecessary stress on the day that they take their assessment for the first time. Beyond that, we also don't want learners to be experiencing anything during their assessment that they've not had an opportunity to interact with before, whether that's item types or features of the system. Particularly important, I think, for students who may have accessibility requirements to understand how those will operate within the assessment for them. So that's why we have familiarisation assessments, and it's really good practice for those to be available for all item types that learners will see, and also in line with the kind of content that they might expect to see at different levels of their education as well.
So, I mean, a key point really is that there needs to be that time built in for familiarisation, right? And let's get a word from Simon Trevors now from Inspira Assessment. Simon, hi. What would you say are the benefits of offering practice familiarisation tests?
There are many benefits of offering practice and familiarisation tests. One of the most obvious ones for a familiarisation test, it might be putting the students in control of exactly when they want to run those kind of tests. You might have some students who want to do that 10 times over several weeks before their high stakes assessment day. Leaving the student in control of when they sit those familiarisation tests, but putting maybe past papers or mock exam questions into those familiarisation tests. Taking advantage of digital assessment technologies, those answers from the student can be automatically marked. So the student is gaining feedback as they're doing the familiarisation test. So they get the benefit of learning how the test system works and being comfortable with the test system. But they're also getting useful feedback about the progress of their knowledge and their learning over time.
Okay, thank you. We've heard quite a lot about why we need to build familiarity into the preparation. Let's just examine the parameters we need to set around that familiarity. I'll go to you first, Ben. What would you say these are?
If we're talking about a high stakes professional assessment that could be taken in a range of settings, potentially delivered in a centre, but also with remote proctoring delivered at home, then you're going to need to have the flexibility to allow those familiarisation assessments to be taken in those different contexts. So there's going to be some autonomy there for learners who are doing the assessments remotely, but also that ability to control in a more kind of group structure. For other assessments, for instance, formative assessments that are delivered by the teacher in a classroom environment, they're normally done as part of a classroom activity, and therefore it's really important to be able to constrain that familiarisation to the class and the classroom where that's taking place. You might not necessarily want the learners to be doing those assessments at home unsupervised and without the appropriate support in place. So you need to make sure that the teacher can control it when the familiarisation assessment is available and when it is not.
Gemma, have you got anything more to add?
So there's a balance to be struck, I think, between allowing for appropriate exposure to the system, so that learners are familiar without classroom or homework practices or study outside of school becoming overly focused on test preparation at the expense of genuine learning.
Thanks, Gemma. Let's just bring in Dave Meller from Alpha Plus. Dave, whose responsibility is it to ensure students have access to devices at home and the same level of platform familiarity?
More and more schools are issuing devices to their students for them to use both in the classroom and at home. But it is a fair challenge. I think the key thing about it is really as long as the learners have access to those devices in the classroom and they are used frequently in the classroom and it's a part of their normal way of working, then they should be familiar with those devices when they come to take the on-screen assessment. So you can't rely on parents or home having the devices for the learners. It has to be the school's responsibility, and the school has to ensure that those learners have access to the devices frequently. It can't just be, oh, we do pen and paper all year and then we make you sit an on-screen assessment at the end of it, because that's not a fair approach for the learners under those circumstances.
Thank you. So good conversation there around familiarity, getting students prepared on devices. Another key aspect of fairness is really around supporting candidates that maybe speak more than one language or that speak different languages. So I know that our studio panel have some experience here. So I'm going to start with you, Ben. How do we ensure fairness of assessments where candidates speak a variety of languages?
So I think this is a really interesting and exciting area when it comes to digital assessment, because it's where we can start to unlock the additional benefits that digital assessments can bring. So to begin with, if you are assessing language in of itself, for instance, the use of English, then I think it's very clear that your policy should state that the assessment takes place in English only and no other language support can be used as appropriate to that particular subject. However, if you're assessing a completely different construct, so for instance, maths, it doesn't really matter what language that mathematical information is conveyed in. What we're seeking to assess is whether or not you can manipulate number or use your math skills. So if you're assessing in English, Welsh, Spanish, whatever the language may be, it doesn't matter. It's the ability to get the maths right that's important. So then you can have a policy which would allow different languages to be brought into the assessment, dependent on the status of different languages in the assessment. So we know that we operate assessments in countries or jurisdictions where two languages have equal status, and we're able to make the assessment toggle between those two different languages. So the assessment can start in one language, and if the learner is unsure because of some of the terminology and feels that it might be helpful to switch into the other language, then the digital assessment is capable of supporting that. So that's a really interesting and exciting feature for the learners, and also promotes that acquisition of the two languages and puts them on that equal status. Once the assessment's been completed, or you've got some data from learners, then you can check that as well, because you can collect performance data and check that, more learners seem to be getting the question right in language A than language B. That can be for a number of factors, but it can prompt that investigation, and you can take some corrective action to perhaps look at the wording and adjust it going forwards as well.
Okay, so comparability, a really key issue when it comes to multilingual exams. So we've explored preparation, familiarisation, and we've also explored multilingual assessments. What about students with accessibility requirements? Ben, I think that the common consensus actually amongst the assessment community is that digital assessments provide lots of opportunities for improving how we assess students with accessibility requirements. What are those opportunities? Are there any challenges at all?
Yeah, sure. And there are a lot of opportunities with digital assessment in this area. As you know, with paper-based conventional assessments, there's limited scope with what you can do. You can produce modified large print papers, but they have to be managed and dealt with as a whole separate kind of workflow. You can allow additional time for those learners that may need it, but that's kind of getting towards the extent of what you're able to offer. With digital assessments, the opportunities are much more extensive. There's a whole range of things that you can do. You can have images which are supported by alternative text, and then you can make the assessment compatible with a screen reader. So that means that there'll be text to voice sound production of the content of the assessment paper, and then if there's an image there, there'll be additional subtitling of that information so that it explains to the learner what's contained within the image. You've got a choice of different images that you can use. So we recommend, where feasible, that we use vector images within on-screen digital assessments, because they're scalable. That means you can zoom in and get lots of the detail, so learners who've got visual impairments are able to look at the screen at the image in a lot more detail, and that will help them access those images as well. You can support the text as well with sound files, so that rather than the screen reader reading out the text, that the learner can click on that and hear the information in a way that's suitable to them. For learners who have motor difficulties, you can use alternative controls on the keyboard rather than the mouse to help them access and interact with the items. There's a really extensive list of things that can be done, and it can often be a little bit over-facing to begin with. We find that a really helpful way of ensuring that the assessments conform to good practices following the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG standards as they're often referred to. These can be applied to a whole range of websites, but if you apply them to your assessments and audit yourself against them, or indeed ask somebody else to do it on your behalf, you can be fairly sure that you're making your assessments user-friendly for learners who've got those accessibility needs.
Okay, thank you. So we've had a really interesting discussion so far around fairness. Let's take it one step further and think about the opportunities that digital assessments can bring, particularly with regards to new item types that we can start adding in. And I'd like to bring in Simon Trevors from Inspira Assessment. Simon, what opportunities can new item types in assessments bring?
Being able to engage students and test takers in new question types that are available on screen that might not be available through other mechanisms, such as being able to record conversations for an English language qualification or any language qualification, being able to record and review a conversation between two students to evaluate their speaking skills in that different language. You could have an examiner watching that conversation and marking that conversation against a rubric live. That's just one example. Computer programming, being able to take advantage of computer programming capabilities within a lockdown, resilient environment where you can test the candidate's skills in any one of very many different programming languages. Numerical simulations for mathematics, for accountancy purposes, being able to take advantage of different symbol palettes that you could enable for different qualifications. It's all about being able to tailor the experience of your candidates and your test takers to the needs of the qualification and the assessment delivery that you're responsible for as an awarding organisation.
Thank you very much. So it's been really interesting discussion around fairness in digital exams. Let's progress this a little bit more, and I'm going to start with Suzanne. Suzanne, what opportunities do having new item types in assessments bring?
So one of the really exciting things about on-screen assessment is that you can introduce all different types of items. Drag and drop items where learners are moving content around a screen, hotspot items where they have to select the right answer from an array of them. We can have videos and audio embedded in the assessment. So for example, you can determine that for a certain age range, audio support is always appropriate, and that can be added into the assessment as a matter of course, or it can be something that you can toggle on and off depending on the needs of the student. Having that kind of audio-visual content is often much more engaging for students, so they actually kind of feel more invested in the assessment. It's something that they actually can enjoy doing. And one thing that is possible is we can have surveys at the end of the assessment to get real-time responses from students to see how they felt about the assessment as they've been going through it.
Okay, I'd like to hear now from Adam Foley from AQA. Adam, we all hear about the opportunities of adaptive assessments and dynamic assessments like Loft and so on. Does using adaptive or dynamic assessments help students in any way?
Dynamic testing or adaptive testing means that candidates going into the exam would be offered a question. If they get that question right, they could get a more complicated question. If they get that question wrong, they get a simpler question. The idea is that as they navigate through the test itself, if we could make sure that all candidates come out having got 40, 50, 60% of the answers correctly, then they can come out feeling confident that when they go into the next exam, they've got just as much chance to do well again. The beauty of adaptive and dynamic testing means that although everybody comes out having answered a certain number of questions correctly, the grade that they would achieve would be different because of the route that the assessment has taken the candidate through. So those getting more complex questions and more demanding questions would likely get a higher grade. Those answering more simplistic questions would get a lower grade. But it's all about candidate confidence and performance coming out. And I think digital exam has the potential to really make sure that our young people can build their confidence over time.
Thank you. So let's now turn to our guests in the studio. Just in summary, when we're talking about fairness, what are the key things we need to keep in mind?
Digital assessments obviously offer quite a lot more opportunity than paper-based assessments in terms of accessibility. Now, when we talk about fairness in assessment, that usually has quite a technical definition. We talk about the absence of bias, particularly for either individual learners or particular groups of learners. And it's clear that that digital assessment approaches can offer lots of advantages in terms of adapting assessments and making them more accessible for learners who have particular needs. We've heard a lot today about kind of digital assessment potentially being more motivating, potentially more enjoyable for learners. And while that's not strictly related to fairness, it is obviously an important part of the assessment that the learner experience is a positive one. Beyond that, there are other advantages of digital assessment and particularly adaptive approaches for learners in terms of how they experience the assessment, that it's possible to get a more accurate measurement of a learner's ability because the questions are more closely calibrated to that ability as they work through an adaptive assessment. And of course, the assessment is much shorter than a typical test would take in terms of getting to that accuracy level.
Thank you, Gemma. Ben, any last words from you?
So the adaptive assessment means that all learners, stronger learners, they'll get, the assessment will ramp up difficulty until they start getting questions incorrect. So you learn about where the limits of their knowledge are, and conversely, a learner who gets questions incorrect, or the assessment will adapt down into such a point that they start getting questions right, and so you can start to see what they can do. So that's giving more information from the assessment and feels like a much more positive experience for the learner.
Thank you. Well, lots to talk about on this subject, but we're out of time. So thank you very much to our panel virtually and here in the studio for this session, and we'll see you next time.